Black bus driver helps a lost little girl, unaware her dad is a billionaire. What happens next? James had been driving the same city bus route for nearly 15 years. He knew every street, every corner, and even most of the regular passengers by face if not by name. His job was not easy, but he always carried himself with calm patience and a smile. Rainy days were the hardest because traffic slowed, people grew restless, and the roads became slippery. On this particular afternoon, the clouds hung low and heavy, and the rain poured in steady sheets, blurring the windshield. As James pulled up to one of the smaller stops along the route, he noticed something unusual. Standing alone near the shelter was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She had long hair that clung damply to her cheeks, and she was clutching a worn teddy bear tightly against her chest. Her small shoes looked soaked through, and her eyes kept darting nervously from the street to the people rushing past. James frowned. Normally, children this young were with their parents or guardians, but this girl was alone. Something about the way she stood there, almost frozen, stirred his heart. As the doors opened with a hiss, he leaned slightly toward her and called out in a gentle voice, "Are you getting on, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated. Her little fingers gripped the teddy bear tighter. Finally, she stepped forward and climbed the steps onto the bus. She looked lost, not only in direction but also in expression. James smiled softly, trying not to alarm her. "Where are you headed?" he asked kindly, keeping his tone as calm as possible. The girl looked up at him with big, tear-filled eyes and whispered, "I don't know. I can't find my daddy." James felt a pang in his chest. He had children of his own, though they were grown now, and he remembered how small and vulnerable they once were. A child separated from her parent in a busy city was one of the scariest things imaginable. He could see her trembling slightly, and he knew she must have been standing outside in the rain for quite some time. He nodded slowly, offering reassurance. "Don't worry. You're safe now. We'll figure this out together." He gestured to the seat directly behind his driver's chair. "Why don't you sit right here so I can keep an eye on you?" The girl obeyed, sliding onto the seat and hugging her teddy close. James started the bus again, though his mind was already working on what to do. He had to finish the route, but he also knew he couldn't leave this child's situation ignored. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he asked softly, "What's your name?" "Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Emily," James replied warmly, "my name is James. You don't need to be scared. We'll find your daddy." She gave a small nod, though her wide eyes showed she was still frightened. To distract her, James tried to make gentle conversation as he drove. "That's a nice teddy you have. What's his name?" "Mr. Buttons," she murmured, lifting the bear slightly so James could see. Despite her fear, the mention of the toy brought the tiniest smile to her lips. James chuckled softly. "Mr. Buttons looks like a brave fellow. I bet he's helping you stay strong." A passenger sitting a few rows back leaned forward, clearly curious about what was happening. James gave him a reassuring glance, silently signaling that everything was under control. He didn't want to make Emily feel like she was the center of attention in a bus full of strangers. The rain continued to patter against the windows as James drove through the city streets. He thought about his own daughter when she was young, remembering how tightly she used to hold his hand whenever they went somewhere crowded. The thought of her being lost like this girl made his heart ache. At the next larger stop, a few more passengers boarded. James kept his focus on the road, but every so often, he glanced back at Emily. She was still hugging Mr. Buttons, but she seemed a little calmer now that someone was speaking to her kindly. During a quiet stretch of the ride, James pulled out his phone at a red light and quickly messaged his supervisor, letting him know about the situation. He explained there was a lost child on board and that he would contact the police once he reached the central station. The supervisor responded immediately, assuring James that help would be arranged. When the light turned green, James pocketed the phone and focused again on driving. "Emily," he said gently, "do you remember the last place you were with your daddy? Was it a park, a shop, maybe somewhere fun?" Emily shook her head, her lips trembling. "There were a lot of people. I looked at the balloons, and then I couldn't find him anymore." James's heart broke at the thought. He could picture it, a crowded street fair or a busy event where a moment's distraction had separated a little girl from her father. He kept his voice steady and calm. "That must have been scary. But you did the right thing waiting at the bus stop. That's very smart." She blinked at him, as though surprised to hear praise. James offered her a warm smile through the mirror. "Smart girls like you always find their way home." As the bus rolled into the central station, James parked in his designated spot and turned slightly in his seat. The girl looked back at him with a mix of fear and hope. "Okay, Emily," he said gently, "we're going to get some help now. The police will make sure your daddy finds you." She nodded nervously, gripping Mr. Buttons tighter. James could tell she still felt uneasy, so he added, "And don't worry, I'll stay right here with you until everything's all right." True to his word, James escorted her off the bus, shielding her with his umbrella as the rain continued to fall. He led her into the station office, where a few staff members immediately gathered, concerned. One of them brought a small blanket to wrap around Emily's shoulders, and she snuggled into it gratefully. James crouched beside her so he was at eye level. "See? You're safe now. These nice people are going to help us call your daddy." For the first time since stepping on the bus, Emily's frightened eyes softened. She gave a tiny nod, her trust in James clear. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of responsibility, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because he knew how much it mattered that this little girl felt protected. As the station staff called the local police, James stayed close, offering quiet words of comfort. The rain outside kept pouring, but inside, Emily was finally safe. What James didn't realize was that this small act of kindness, choosing to notice, choosing to help, and choosing to stay, was about to change his life in ways he never imagined. The police had been contacted, and Emily was sitting in the office of the bus station wrapped in a small blanket. She clutched Mr. Buttons, her teddy bear, close to her chest while her eyes followed James wherever he moved. She didn't want him to go too far away. For her, he had already become the one person she could trust in this scary situation. James knew he needed to keep her calm while waiting for the authorities to arrive. He remembered from his own children that when kids were upset, food and gentle words could do wonders. He asked one of the staff members to watch his bus for a few minutes and then turned to Emily with a smile. "Emily," he said softly, "are you hungry?" Her head tilted slightly, and though she didn't speak, her little stomach betrayed her with a small growl. James chuckled kindly. "I think that's a yes. Come on, let's get you something to eat." He walked her to a small shop just a few steps inside the station. The warm lights and smell of freshly baked bread greeted them as they entered. James bent down and pointed to the display case. "What would you like? A sandwich? Maybe some juice too?" Emily's eyes widened at the choices. She hesitated before whispering, "Cheese sandwich, please." James smiled. "Cheese sandwich it is. And a little juice to go with it." He paid for the food and handed it to her carefully. Emily sat at a small table, nibbling at the sandwich slowly. She seemed more relaxed now, though she still held her teddy close with one arm while eating with the other. James sat across from her, sipping water, watching her in silence. He didn't want to bombard her with questions that might make her feel pressured. Instead, he spoke in small, gentle ways, letting her lead. "That's a nice choice," he said as she took another bite. "Cheese sandwiches were always my favorite too when I was your age." Emily looked at him shyly, her lips curving into the smallest smile. "Really? Really, James replied with a chuckle. I used to ask my mom to make them for me almost every day. The ice between them was slowly breaking. The fear in her eyes began to melt away, replaced by a quiet trust. She finished her sandwich and drank the juice, then leaned back slightly in her chair, sighing softly as if a little bit of her worry had lifted. One of the station staff peeked into the shop and gestured to James. The police are on their way. They'll be here shortly, the man whispered. James nodded in acknowledgement, then turned back to Emily. Good news, Emily. Some nice officers are coming to help us find your daddy. Isn't that great? Emily's fingers curled around Mr. Button's. Will they be kind like you? She asked softly. James's heart tightened at the question. He reached out gently and patted her hand. Yes, sweetheart. They'll be very kind. And I'll be right here with you until you're with your daddy again. Her shoulders relaxed a little at his words. She leaned her cheek against the teddy bear and looked around the shop, distracted now by the colorful candy bars lined up by the counter. James chuckled. Maybe later, if your dad says it's okay, you'll get to pick one of those. As they walked back to the waiting area, a few passengers from the bus spotted them and smiled at James knowingly. They had seen how tenderly he treated the child. One woman whispered to another, that driver is a good man. Not many people would take the time like that. James heard it but didn't respond. He wasn't doing this for praise. For him, it was simple, a child needed help, and helping her was the only thing that mattered. When they returned to the office, Emily sat in a chair near the window, her teddy still in her arms. The rain had slowed outside, leaving streaks of water sliding down the glass. James sat beside her, folding his big hands on his knees. He decided to gently keep her mind busy while they waited. So, Emily, he said with a small smile, what do you like to do for fun? Do you like to draw, or play outside, or maybe read books? Her face lit up ever so slightly. I like drawing. I draw my teddy and sometimes my daddy. That sounds wonderful, James replied. I bet you're a great artist. You know, when I was young, I used to draw buses all the time. Maybe one day you can draw Mr. Buttons riding a bus. Emily giggled softly at the idea. Mr. Buttons doesn't have a ticket, she said playfully. James laughed warmly. Well, I think Mr. Buttons gets a free ride. Special passengers like him don't need tickets. That little moment of shared laughter filled the room with a sense of lightness. Emily seemed less like a frightened lost child and more like any other little girl having a safe conversation with a kind adult. Soon after, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and two uniformed police officers appeared at the door. They carried warm, reassuring expressions. One of them knelt down to Emily's level and spoke gently. Hi there, sweetheart. My name's Officer Daniel. We're here to help you find your daddy. Emily's eyes widened, and she instinctively leaned closer to James. He rested his hand on her shoulder. It's okay, Emily. These are the kind people I told you about. They're here to make sure you're safe. The officer nodded and spoke softly. Can you tell us your full name, sweetheart? Emily hesitated, then whispered, Emily Grace. The officers exchanged a quick glance, their expressions shifting with recognition. They didn't say anything out loud, but James noticed something pass between them. Still, they kept their calm and continued asking simple questions: what Emily remembered before getting lost, and what her daddy looked like. Emily answered as best she could, though sometimes she got quiet, and James would gently encourage her with a nod or a smile. Once they had enough information, one of the officers stepped outside to make a call. The other officer stayed with Emily, talking to her about her teddy and keeping her comfortable. James stayed by her side the entire time, never letting her feel abandoned. The minutes stretched into nearly an hour, but James never once grew impatient. He told Emily a few light-hearted stories from his bus driving days about funny passengers, about how sometimes pigeons tried to sneak onto his bus, and about a little boy who once brought a toy car and raced it down the aisle. Emily listened with wide eyes, giggling softly at the sillier parts. Finally, the officer who had stepped outside returned. He leaned toward his partner and whispered something that made both of them straighten their shoulders slightly. Then the officer smiled warmly at Emily. "Good news. We've spoken to your daddy. He's on his way right now to come and get you." Emily gasped, her eyes shining with relief. She turned to James, her tiny voice trembling with happiness. "I'll see my daddy." James nodded, smiling with deep warmth. "Yes, sweetheart. You'll be with him very soon." She hugged Mr. Buttons tightly, her little feet swinging as she sat on the chair. The joy in her face was clear, but what James didn't know was just who her father really was, or how this meeting would soon turn his ordinary day into something extraordinary. Rain had slowed to a drizzle when the sound of heavy engines rolled into the bus station. At first, James thought it was just another delivery truck or maybe a city official's car. But then he noticed the way the officers straightened their posture, and the station staff hurried to the windows. Outside, a line of sleek black cars pulled up, polished so clean that even under the gray skies they reflected the streetlights. Men in dark suits stepped out quickly, scanning the surroundings with sharp, practiced eyes. James blinked in surprise. He had seen security guards before, but never this many, and never with such serious expressions. They moved with precision, like every step was rehearsed. For a moment, he wondered if some politician or celebrity was about to walk in. But then Emily, who had been sitting beside him, suddenly gasped. Her little hands clutched Mr. Buttons, and her eyes grew wide with recognition. She slid off her chair, almost toppling forward, and whispered breathlessly, "Daddy." James turned just as a tall man stepped out of the largest car. Even from a distance, the man's presence was undeniable. He wore a tailored dark coat, his hair slicked back neatly, and his sharp features carried an intensity that made people instinctively step aside. He didn't walk so much as stride with purpose, every motion full of urgency. The moment his eyes fell on Emily, his stern face softened with pure relief. "Emily," he called, his deep voice echoing in the station. "Daddy!" Emily cried, rushing toward him with small but determined steps. She threw herself into his arms, and he knelt instantly, wrapping her up in a fierce embrace. He held her so tightly, as if afraid she might disappear again. His eyes, which had been cold moments before, now shone with emotion. James stood frozen, taking in the scene. It didn't take him long to realize this wasn't just any father. The man's arrival, the guards, the expensive cars, all of it pointed to someone important. Whispers rose among the station staff. "That's Richard Grace," one worker murmured in awe. "The billionaire." James's eyebrows shot up. He had heard the name before. Richard Grace, a powerful businessman whose empire stretched across hotels, technology, and investments. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, always in the news for his success but rarely seen in public outside of big events. To think that Emily, the small girl he had found alone in the rain, was his daughter was almost impossible to believe. Richard Grace pulled back slightly from the hug, his hands still on Emily's shoulders. "Are you all right, sweetheart? Did anyone hurt you? Were you scared?" Emily shook her head quickly, clutching her teddy. "I was lost, Daddy. But, the bus driver helped me. He kept me safe." Richard followed her small hand as she pointed across the room straight at James. For a moment, the billionaire's gaze locked onto James. It was sharp, intense, the kind of look that could unsettle even the bravest of men. James shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how ordinary he must appear in his bus driver's uniform, rain-speckled jacket, and tired eyes. Richard stood, keeping one hand protectively on Emily's shoulder, and walked toward James. The security guards watched closely but didn't intervene. The room seemed to grow quieter with every step he took. "You," Richard said firmly, his voice deep but controlled. "You're the one who stayed with my daughter." James cleared his throat, trying to keep his composure. "Yes, sir. I found her alone at a bus stop. She looked lost, so I made sure she was safe until help arrived." Emily tugged at her father's coat. "Daddy, he gave me food too. And he told me stories so I wouldn't be scared." Hearing that, Richard's stern expression wavered. He glanced back at his daughter, then at James again. "You bought her food." James shrugged lightly, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just a sandwich and some juice. She hadn't eaten, and I didn't want her to sit there hungry." There was a pause. The weight of Richard's silence filled the room. Everyone watched, waiting to see how the billionaire would respond. Finally, Richard extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his tone softer now. "You don't know what this means to me." James shook his hand firmly. Anyone would have done the same. But Richard shook his head slightly. "No. Not anyone. Many would have walked past. Many would have thought it wasn't their problem. But you stayed." Emily looked up at her father with a bright smile. "I told you, Daddy. He's kind. He said Mr. Buttons gets a free ride on his bus." Richard actually let out the smallest laugh at that, his gaze flicking back to James with a trace of warmth. "Did he, now?" "Yes." Emily giggled. "He said Mr. Buttons is a special passenger." For a few moments, the heavy atmosphere lifted. Even the guards standing nearby seemed to ease slightly at the sound of Emily's laughter. Richard placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You've given me back what no amount of money could replace. My little girl's safety. I will never forget this." James shook his head again. "I didn't do it for thanks or rewards. I just couldn't leave her alone. She reminded me of my own daughter when she was little." Richard studied him for a long moment, as though trying to measure the truth of his words. Whatever he saw seemed to strike him deeply. He nodded slowly, his respect evident. The officers who had been standing by stepped forward. "Mr. Grace, everything's in order. We'll just need to file a quick report, but your daughter is safe." Richard nodded and then turned back to James. "Will you stay a little longer? I'd like to speak with you after this is finished." James hesitated, unsure what a man of such wealth and power could possibly want with a bus driver like him. But he nodded. "Of course." As the officers handled the formalities, Emily refused to let go of her teddy or her father's hand. But every few minutes, she glanced back at James, her eyes filled with gratitude and trust. It was clear to everyone that in the short time they had been together, she had come to see him as her protector. The drizzle outside finally stopped, leaving the streets damp but quiet. Inside the station, people slowly went back to their work, though they whispered about the surprising scene they had just witnessed. James leaned against the wall, taking it all in. He had started the day like any other, driving his route, expecting nothing more than the usual noise and routine. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of an unbelievable moment, having helped a little girl who turned out to be the daughter of one of the richest men in the country. He didn't know what would happen next, but something told him his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined. James stood quietly near the corner of the bus station office while the officers wrapped up their report with Richard Grace. The billionaire kept his daughter close to his side, one arm protectively around her shoulders as if he was afraid to let go even for a second. Emily leaned against him, still holding tightly to Mr. Buttons, but her face was glowing with happiness now that she was reunited with her father. Every so often, she peeked over at James and smiled shyly, a silent way of reminding him that she hadn't forgotten his kindness. When the officers finally finished their questions and paperwork, they shook hands with Richard and wished Emily well. Then they left, their duty complete. The station, which had been buzzing with tension, grew calmer again. Richard looked at James, his sharp eyes softening a little. "Would you come with us for a moment? I'd like to talk to you in private." James hesitated. He wasn't used to being around men like Richard Grace, whose every word carried weight and power. But Emily was watching him hopefully, so he nodded. "All right." The guards led them to a quieter lounge area in the station, away from curious eyes. James followed, feeling out of place in his bus driver's uniform while standing among men in fine suits and polished shoes. But he reminded himself that he hadn't done anything special, he had only helped a child in need. When they were seated, Richard leaned forward slightly. "James, is it? That's your name?" "Yes, sir." "James Carter," he replied politely. Richard nodded. "James, I owe you more than I can ever express. You found my daughter when she was lost and vulnerable. You fed her, comforted her, and stayed by her side when you could have simply moved on. Do you understand how rare that is in today's world?" James shifted uncomfortably, his modesty shining through. "I just did what any father would do if he saw a little one alone. It didn't feel right to walk away. She needed someone, and I happened to be there." Emily piped up suddenly, her small voice clear. "Daddy, he's telling the truth. He made me laugh and told me Mr. Buttons gets free bus rides. He was very nice." Richard's expression softened further as he looked at his daughter, then back at James. "My daughter doesn't open up to strangers easily. But she trusted you. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of man you are." He paused, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "I want to reward you, James. Whatever you want, money, opportunities, anything, just say the word." James shook his head quickly. "With respect, sir, I don't need a reward. I didn't help her for money or recognition. She's a child, and she was scared. I only wanted to make sure she was safe until she could be back with her family." Richard studied him in silence for a long moment. Most people, he knew, would have seized the chance to ask for something. But James's refusal didn't feel like false modesty. It felt genuine. "Still," Richard said finally, "you deserve something. I can't just shake your hand and walk away as though nothing happened. My daughter could have been taken, hurt, or worse. You prevented that. You gave me back the most important person in my life." James looked at him steadily. "The only thing I want is to know she's all right. That's enough for me." Emily tugged at her father's coat again. "Daddy, can we please do something nice for him? He helped me so much." Richard smiled faintly at his daughter's insistence. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We will." Then he turned back to James. "I see you're a humble man. But let me ask you this, do you have a family of your own?" James nodded slowly. "Yes. I have 2 children, though they're grown now. My son's working, and my daughter's in college. And I take care of my mother as well, she's elderly and needs some support." Richard leaned back, thoughtful. "So you work long hours to provide for them, and you still found it in your heart to look after a stranger's child. That speaks volumes about your character." James didn't respond. He wasn't used to being praised so directly, especially by someone as important as Richard Grace. After a pause, Richard spoke again, his voice firm. "James, I want to do something for you not because you asked, but because it's the right thing to do. People like you, with integrity and kindness, deserve recognition." James opened his mouth to protest, but Richard raised a hand to stop him. "Hear me out. You said you don't want money in your pocket. Fine. But what about your children? Would you turn down a scholarship fund for them? Would you refuse help for your mother's health care? These things are not luxuries, they are necessities. Let me give back in a way that truly matters." James fell silent. He hadn't expected such an offer, and it shook him. The thought of his daughter not having to struggle to pay her college fees, or his mother receiving proper medical care, was overwhelming. But still, his pride made him hesitate. James began slowly, choosing his words carefully. It's hard for me to accept something I didn't earn. Richard's gaze softened. You did earn it, James. Not through contracts or deals, but through kindness. You gave my daughter safety when she had nothing else. That is priceless. Emily leaned forward eagerly. Please, James. Let Daddy help you. I want him to. Her innocent plea struck James harder than Richard's words. Looking into her hopeful eyes, he realized refusing would only take away her joy. She wanted to see him rewarded for being there when she needed him. Finally, James sighed softly. All right. But only if it truly helps my family. I don't want anything for myself. Richard smiled at last, a genuine smile that softened his normally stern face. You have my word. I'll take care of it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek card, and handed it to James. This has my personal number. If you ever need anything, you call me directly. From this day on, you're not just a bus driver I happen to meet. You're someone I respect. James accepted the card, still feeling a little overwhelmed. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Say nothing, Richard replied firmly. Just keep being the man you already are. That's enough. Emily skipped over to James and wrapped her small arms around him in a quick hug. Thank you for finding me, she whispered. James bent down slightly and patted her shoulder gently. Take care of Mr. Buttons, all right? And listen to your daddy. She giggled and nodded, stepping back to her father's side. As James watched them leave with their convoy of cars, he stood in silence, processing everything that had just happened. He had started the day simply trying to drive his bus route. Now he was walking away with the gratitude of a billionaire, the affection of a little girl, and the possibility of a brighter future for his own family. And though he didn't realize it yet, the reward that Richard Grace had in mind would go far beyond anything James could imagine. The next morning, James woke up at his usual time before sunrise. The city was still quiet, the streets outside wet from the night's rain. He put on his worn uniform, tied his shoes, and made himself a quick cup of tea before heading out for another long day of driving. To him, yesterday had felt like something out of a dream, finding a lost little girl, learning she was the daughter of a billionaire, and then receiving a promise of help from her father. But as the morning settled in, James convinced himself that maybe nothing more would come of it. He had done his part, and that was enough. When he arrived at the bus depot, however, the day felt different. The supervisor, usually gruff and hurried, greeted him with unusual warmth. James, you've got people asking about you. Important people. James frowned. Important. Before the supervisor could explain, two black cars pulled into the depot. Out stepped two men in suits, carrying documents. They walked straight to James. Mr. Carter, one asked politely. Yes, James replied, a little uneasy. The man smiled. We're here on behalf of Mr. Richard Grace. He's asked us to deliver something to you. They handed James an envelope, heavy and sealed with a neat crest. James opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in clear, formal handwriting. James, as promised, I've arranged a scholarship fund that will fully cover your daughter's education until she completes her degree, and any further studies she wishes to pursue. Additionally, I've set up a medical account dedicated to your mother's care so she can have the treatment she needs without financial worry. Lastly, I'd like to offer you a position in my company's transportation division, a role that comes with better pay, benefits, and respect fitting of a man of your integrity. This is not charity. This is gratitude. Accept it with pride. Richard Grace. James's hands trembled slightly as he read. He looked up at the men, almost speechless. This is too much. It's what Mr. Grace wanted, one of the men replied kindly. He said you deserve it. For a moment, James couldn't speak. The thought of his daughter no longer struggling with tuition, of his mother finally receiving proper medical care, and of having a better job, it was overwhelming. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, though he quickly blinked them back. He whispered softly, more to himself than to anyone else, all this, because I helped a little girl. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. It was because he had chosen to care when others might not have. That evening, James shared the news with his family. His daughter cried tears of joy, hugging him tightly. Dad, I don't have to worry about my fees anymore. I can study without fear of dropping out. His son grinned proudly. You always taught us to do the right thing, Dad. And look how it's come back to you. His mother, frail but sharp-eyed, patted his hand gently. You see, James. Kindness never goes unnoticed. You've always been a good man. Now the world knows it too. The days that followed brought even more changes. James met with Richard Grace personally at his office in a towering glass building downtown. The billionaire greeted him not with the cold authority of a powerful man, but with the warmth of a grateful father. Emily was there too, running up to James with a bright smile. James. Mr. Buttons misses riding the bus with you. James laughed, kneeling to her level. Well, you'll have to bring him by sometime. Special passengers are always welcome. Richard shook James's hand firmly. I meant what I wrote. That scholarship, that healthcare, that new position, they're all yours. No conditions, no strings attached. Just my gratitude. James tried once again to protest. Sir, I don't know if I can accept so much. Richard cut him off gently. You already accepted when you chose to help my daughter. This is not a gift, it's a responsibility fulfilled. If our places were reversed, wouldn't you do the same for someone who saved your child? James thought about it. He realized Richard was right. Any parent would go to the ends of the earth for their child. Accepting wasn't selfish. It was simply the natural result of kindness meeting gratitude. So James began his new role at the company, overseeing transportation logistics. It was different from driving a bus, but he quickly adapted. His years of experience on the road gave him insights others in the office lacked. He suggested safer routes, better schedules, and ways to treat drivers with more respect. His colleagues noticed his honesty and practical wisdom, and slowly, he earned admiration not just as a man who had been the hero bus driver, but as someone capable and reliable in his new position. At home, life grew brighter. His daughter excelled in her studies without the heavy burden of tuition fees. She told her friends proudly that her father's kindness had opened doors she never thought possible. His mother received treatments that eased her pain, giving her more comfort in her later years. And James himself, though still humble, began to walk with a lighter step, knowing his family's future was more secure. But through it all, he never changed who he was. He still greeted people with kindness, still offered his seat to strangers, still gave a smile to anyone who looked like they needed it. He never let the recognition or the reward alter his simple belief that doing good was its own reward. Months later, on a quiet Sunday, James was invited to the Grace family's home. It was a sprawling estate with gardens that seemed to stretch forever. James felt a little out of place in his modest clothes, but Emily ran to him as soon as he arrived, holding Mr. Buttons high. James. Look, Mr. Buttons wants to say thank you again, she said cheerfully. James chuckled, patting the teddy bear. Well, you tell him he's very welcome. Richard joined them, watching with a smile. She hasn't stopped talking about you. You made quite an impression. James shrugged modestly. She's a special girl. Anyone would have done the same. Richard looked at him with quiet admiration. No, James. Not anyone. That's why this world needs people like you to remind us of what really matters. The afternoon passed with laughter, good food, and warm conversation. For James, it wasn't the wealth or the luxury that mattered, but the connection. A simple act on a rainy afternoon had created a bond between two families from completely different worlds. When James returned home that evening, he sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the rooftops. The sky glowed with hues of orange and gold, and he felt a deep peace settle in his heart. He thought about the chain of events: the rain, the bus stop, the frightened little girl, the billionaire father, and how all of it had unfolded into something extraordinary. He realized that sometimes the smallest choices could change not only one life, but many. By choosing to stop and care for a child, he had unknowingly altered the course of his own future and secured blessings for his family. And though he now had more security and comfort than before, James remained the same at heart. He knew that true wealth wasn't measured in money or possessions, but in kindness, love, and the lives touched along the way. As the evening breeze rustled the trees, James smiled to himself. Life had given him an unexpected gift, but the greatest reward of all was knowing that he had made a difference when it mattered most. And he carried that truth with him every day, ready to keep helping others, one small act of kindness at a time.